Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome to Panel 3 Understanding to Act Better Different Roles of Women in Violent Extremism. I am Zainab Benalla and I will be moderating this session. This panel represents an opportunity for debating the current women's situation in VE groups, whether women are victims, they are security threats. Our speakers will look at different profiles of females as victims or as a threat. They will look at different forms of violence that women suffer from. They will look at the different regions, the Sahel region, as well as North Africa. They will look at, ISIS and Boko Haram and the different roles of women, as well as one of the most challenging contemporary security threats, female returnees, and the role of women in reintegration and rehabilitation programs. So, welcome again. Each speaker, we have four terrific speakers. Each speaker will have 10 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions and answers and discussion. Our first speaker is Mr. Reda Liamouri, who is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. He focuses on geopolitics and international relations issues. He has more than 8 years experience focusing on North Africa as well as the Sahel region. His extensive experience supporting government and non-government organizations includes the areas of international development, security, countering violent extremism, and counterterrorism. Mr. Rida will speak about women in different VE groups in the Sahel region. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Zainab, and thanks for having me. Thanks to PCNS for Policy Center for the New South for organizing this year's Apsaco event, although it's remote. I think we hope that we can do this in person soon, inshallah. I'm going to talk about the Sahel region and West Africa in general, and I will talk briefly about some of the trends observed about women in the Sahel region related to violence extremism and also violent conflict, ongoing violent conflicts in general. And then I will speak about provide some recommendations, but also some of the key roles that women could play going forward in the prevention and combating violence extremism. First, I would like to start by a personal story because I always give this example that women have a big role to play when it comes to violence extremism, or just in terms of prevention and the role that could play within the family, either a sister, a daughter, or a mom. But my experience, it's based on my mother, who's illiterate, who never went to school, yet provided resilience in our household that I could not explain, because we give the example. My brother was following trends of Salafism in the early 90s when it was making its way in Morocco, and he started trying to impose on us in the household, and he's a teenager, and then he was trying to impose this trends on the family, including my sisters or my brothers, etc. And then my mother, who's illiterate and not equipped or trained enough in religion, stood up to him and put an end to that. And that was it. So he never mentioned that again. So that story stuck with me, and that's why I think the role of moms or sisters or daughters, I think, have a big role to play to prevent any sort of disruption, not necessarily just violence extremism. So going back to women in the Sahel, and I think the research have demonstrated in the Sahel that women are not the main victim, not the main target when it comes to violence extremism. The main targets are men, and then women are women are victims as we say, collateral damage when violence occur and violent attacks occurred by or occurred by violent extremist organizations. Um, However, when we look at the Lake Chad Basin, we see different trends. Women have been abducted, have been forced to marriage, have been kidnapped for in order to be exchanged for ransoms, and we continue to see these trends around Lake Chad Basin, especially in Nigeria, and this acts have been carried mainly by Boko Haram. When we look at, so and to go back to the Sahel, even that they have not been the major victim, uh, we are seeing increasingly control of women in some areas of the region, including in central Mali, northern Burkina Faso, and also West Niger in Tillaberi region. And some of these restrictions include their movement, limiting their movement, their behaviors, their activities, dress code, for example, as well as traveling. When they are traveling, they cannot travel with men in the same, cannot go to participate as often as they would like to when it comes to economic activities. Uh, However, that being said, women also demonstrated some resilience in those areas as they managed, in addition, in collaboration with traditional authorities in those areas, to negotiate with violent extremist organizations that they can continue to go to the markets and conduct trade, for example. They accept, so what I call is the opting out of war, and then there is a study about that. Like they choose to negotiate some ways of coexisting with the extremist organizations and accept some rules and refuse others. For example, as I said, they accepted to have that dress code. They accepted not to travel in the same vehicle with men. Those are just some examples. At the same time, they insisted on continuing to be involved in the local economy. They continued to travel to local markets to sell spices, dry fish, whatever activity they are involved in those areas. So, to summarize this trend and the difference between Sahel and Lake Chad Basin, in the Sahel, women have not been the main target, and there have been some restrictions towards their behavior and movement. However, in the Lake Chad Basin, we are seeing abductions, forced marriage, and kidnappings for ransoms. The third point, the other point that I would like to mention, and this is more so I can move towards recommendations. Uh, I would say, and as a researcher in the region, the struggle I'm facing is there is a lack of information about the role of women in conflict in general, not necessarily just in terms of recruitment or role in violence extremist groups, but in conflicts in general. We still don't know how much their male counterparts share with them in the household or in the community and the role of the conflict. How much they are talking to them about what they are doing. Do women know what their husbands, brothers, or sons are doing when they are not at home? When they say, "Oh, I'm going to for seasonal work across the border in Mali or Niger or Burkina Faso," and disappear for a couple of months and return. We don't know how much they are sharing with them, and we don't know how much truth they are telling them, and therefore, so we don't know how much women could do if they don't know. So they say that's the challenge I'm finding for internal when it comes to making recommendations to policymakers about what they could do and to work with women when it comes to prevention. And also the other challenge that we need to also look at, consider in a lot of places in the Sahel, violent extremist organizations are seen as protectors rather than threat. In areas where state is absent, and there are all sorts of armed groups and armed actors, including armed bandits, and a lot of violence data show that violence against women not necessarily carried by violence extremist organizations. It's carried by different armed actors. So that challenge of um, the legitimacy that the state has in these areas, because these extremist organizations are becoming legitimate in these areas, so they are seen as protectors rather than threats. So that makes it really challenging for prevention efforts going forward. I will stop here, and looking forward to hear everyone else what has to say, and to questions. You are muted, Zainab.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rida. Thanks for respecting the time. You still have 1 minute if you want to add something, or I'll steal your 1 minute. You are the only gentleman in the panel today. So we'll move now to our second speaker, Dr. Nayanka, who is a program associate at the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. She was formerly the head of the ELC Peace and Security Fellowship Program at the African Leadership Center, King's College London. Nayanka's background is on leadership, state building processes, violent conflict, and peace building in Africa. Today, Dr. Nayanka will speak about the different roles that women play in Boko Haram crises, from victims to perpetrators to agents of counter radicalization, and the markers of vulnerabilities to violent extremism to look for when discussing women and violent extremism. Then she will conclude with recommendation. Thank you, Dr. Nayanka. The floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Zinad. As you mentioned, my background is in peace and security, but I will try today to kind of explore kind of the social context of radicalization for women in northeastern Nigeria. And I hope that that will then highlight kind of the potential markers for vulnerability that one could look for when looking at violent extremism. I hope I will make good use of the time. I think I have a lot to go through. So we know that women are involved in terrorism. According to the 2019 Global Terrorism Index, female suicide attacks are 5% more deadly than those executed by males, often given because of their capability to circumvent security scrutiny, and these are becoming more common. But we also know that women play all kinds of different roles once they find themselves in terrorist organizations. So from collecting intelligence to conducting surveillance on potential targets to recruitment of young people, or carrying out suicide attacks, financing terror operations, as well as more kind of traditional gender roles such as taking care of group members' needs, cooking and cleaning. Women are often also the source of radicalization, urging others to join as part of their duty to carry out jihad. So while we have on one end of the spectrum women who believe they should support extremist organizations, on the other end of the spectrum, and it's quite important that we talk about that, there are women who are working tirelessly to eradicate violent ideology. So given what we know, this becomes a lot more complex depending on the context that one is looking at, especially if you're bringing other factors such as religion, gender, and societal norms, potential conflict situations like we have seen in some part of West Africa and the Sahel, or even northeastern Mozambique more recently. So if I dive in quickly into the case study of women in northern Nigeria, there has been some key work done by scholars such as Zainab Usman, Shireen El Tarabusi Makati, and Khadija Hawaja, who look at the varied ways in which women have been involved in Boko Haram. Firstly, as victims, secondly, as perpetrators, and thirdly, as forces for counter-radicalization. So their work goes beyond the typical ideas we have of women's involvement in Boko Haram and look at their particular vulnerabilities as well as their constant gender struggles within northern Nigerian Islam. So context here matters and it is important. In this particular context, gender norms in northern Nigerian society have shaped women's engagement with Boko Haram. So key findings show that not all women who participate in radical Islamist movements are themselves radicalized. Indeed, northern Nigerian women have engaged with Boko Haram in a variety of ways and for a variety of reasons. Firstly, we need to look at Northern Nigerian women and understand that they are highly differentiated by sect, ethnicity, education, as well as socioeconomic status. And these factors interact with highly patriarchal gender norms of traditional Islamic practice in Northern Nigeria to kind of create various forms of either Islamic activism, from progressive civil society groups to violent Islamic sects. However, there's also pervasive illiteracy, severe economic deprivation, and high levels of dependence on male breadwinners, and that increases the vulnerability of often poor Northern women to being drawn into violent movements such as Boko Haram. If we look at victims and active participants, understanding how Northern Nigerian women are drawn into radical Islamic groups also requires us to understand their economic dependence on men and the traditional Islamic embedding of their roles and rights within their family duties. So joining Boko Haram is more about carrying out traditional gender roles than about resisting female subordination. Female members of Boko Haram do not necessarily operate independently of the men, and oftentimes their participation is conditioned by that of male members of their family. For women that are directly involved in Boko Haram, either as coerced victims or active participants, women are largely in a subordinate position to the men to whom they are married or attached to individually, or to the male leadership of the group as a whole. And this is a reflection and a reproduction of the larger society's gender norms, where the most exemplary women are not expected to act as individuals, but their actions and existence are largely conditioned by the support to the male figures in their lives. In both cases, though, the necessity of having women in a supportive capacity to undertake domestic chores or for companionship, as well as for tactical deployment in violent activities, has actually driven the voluntary recruitment and coercion of women into the sect. So both coerced and active participants often end up performing relatively similar support roles in Boko Haram. And active participants could initially be coerced and then accept and internalize radical doctrine, and then also actively propagate that at a later stage. If we think about counteragents, though, which I think is one of the most important points when we look at violent extremism in Northern Nigeria, is that contrary to the prevailing literature on Boko Haram, women also play an important role in countering radicalization. And that defies kind of the binary way in which we think of there's a subjugated participant or there's an active perpetrator of violence. So this dimension of women's involvement in counter-radicalization, it goes through a spectrum of activities, from relief work with IDPs or other victims of violence to local and international activism against radicalization, and even active engagement on the front lines in the war on Boko Haram. And this has been seen with a particular case in Nigeria, which looks at what is informally known as a civilian joint task force, which is made up of both men and women, but there's a significant number of women that take part, where they gather intelligence on suspected militants to report to the authorities. They operate their own checkpoints, and they even participate in the arrest and apprehension of female Boko Haram suspects. So this, according to interviews conducted, is a direct response to the frustration faced by the communities and the lack of support that they have received from their government in dealing with this crisis. And these are often young people, women in their 20s and 30s, volunteers, students, widows, single people, and they have also tried to address the government and ask for more support, training, and stipends in order to continue this important work. And I think women's active engagement in this particular context can be seen, draws from a long history of Islamic women's civil society organizations that pursue kind of these socially progressive objectives of advancing women's welfare and their rights. So in this particular context, life in Nigeria, in Nigeria's Northeast, is a chronic struggle for women, whether it's under the federal government, which often fails to provide basic services to its citizens, or under the insurgency, which exploits women to achieve its own aims as well. So if we think about women being hurt by the state neglect, as well as insurgent tactics, we need to remember they are not passive objects of either of those. The notion of women as Boko Haram victims often ignores the long history of women's suffering in the particular context of the Northeast and obscures the ways in which women's aspirations have fed, but also, most importantly, could help resolve the conflict. As I conclude, where does this leave us and what kinds of recommendations or discussions can we have around this? Firstly, is to involve women in dialogue, to bridge the gap between state and non-state actors or violent groups. Because of this growing gap between state security, which is often the security of privileged elites, and human security, which is the aspiration of normal citizens to have their basic needs met, access to social services, violent extremism has become more widespread. So, and the current approach that we've seen across in Nigeria, Sahel, and Mozambique, for example, with dealing with this has been through exclusive use of force, of state defense, self-defense. However, that has not been productive and it's not sustainable. So we need to adopt soft power approaches such as de-radicalization and reintegration of individuals who have joined these extremist groups. We've seen this, there's a NIM foundation in Nigeria that works to provide mental health care and support to those victims of Boko Haram, for example. Secondly, dialogue is effective. So let's make sure that we are allowing women to be part of that dialogue. Let's acknowledge women's leadership as well, recognizing and appreciating that this is an important factor in order to resolve the situation. And finally, more research on women and terrorism is needed, as Rita has mentioned. Also, policymakers must avoid oversimplification. Women are not homogeneous, they have individual agency, but most importantly, as I hope the case study illustrates, every community exists in a unique context informed by cultural, social, and geopolitical factors. Thus, a one-size-fits-all approach to this engagement of women and their dialogue in this process would be problematic. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nayanka. I have many questions myself, about, how you describe the role of women, and then, all the implications, looking at the different narratives, women as victims versus women as, a threat, and that all that should be considered, and not only considering women as only victims. And now we will move to our third speaker, Dr. Harmony Taurus, Associate Professor at the University of Kent. Dr. Taurus' research lies at the crossroad between conflict resolution, conflict transformation, peace studies, and terrorism studies. She has published seminal work developing a critical theory-based approach to terrorism and examining the transformation of conflict marked by terrorist violence. She has carried out extensive field research in Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa, researching state and non-state armed groups, as well as investigating the human experience of war from combatant to non-combatant perspective. In 2015, Dr. Harmony was awarded the university's inaugural Research Prize, Early Career Researchers category. And today, Dr. Taurus will focus on narratives of women in violent extremism, particularly examining the gendered constructions in state narratives and their implication for policies and practices. Of course, looking at narratives of victimhood and the lack of agency awarded to women in VE will be particularly focused on. Dr. Harmony, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zineb, and thank you so much for these fabulous, interventions, really important interventions on the contextualization and to avoid this sort of one-size-fits-all argument, which is always so problematic when it comes to violent extremism and when it comes to women. So I think that we have the double sort of problem here. What I'd like to talk about in my 10 minutes is the idea of there are differences in what roles women take up in violent extremist groups and in combating violent extremist groups. And then there's the narratives that we have. And the narratives tend to be less varied than the actual roles, right? So there's an oversimplification, I would say, that happens nearly intrinsically in the narratives that emerge, or certainly in the dominant narratives. And very often one of the key narratives that emerges is the narrative of women as victims, women who haven't chosen to take part in any form of violent extremism, and this obviously has a series of implications, which I will come to. But I mean, it conforms with an understanding of women as weak, as non-agential, as unable to make as depoliticized and unpolitical as actors, and women as essentially attached to a man, right? So they follow a man, they are forced to by a man, and or they are seduced by a man and therefore engage in violence. And even when we look at women's roles in de-radicalization and encountering violent extremism, once again it's women in terms of their relationship to men. So women as mothers, women as wives, women as sisters, women as daughters, right? And so the question then becomes, is there a space, is there a place for women, right? Women as individual social political actors who have their own agency. And in the narratives, that space is extraordinarily reduced. And this is, I would say, across the world, right? There may not be a one size fit all, but there seems to be a general tendency of reducing the space for agential political women to a very, very, very small space across cultures, across continents, and across regions. And what I'd like to speak about to a certain degree is the implications of this for policy, but also the implications of this for the women who become involved and recruitment potentially. So I'd like to start by talking about empowerment. And so empowering narratives and disempowering narratives. I think it was quite interesting in a work that we did for the NATO Southern Hub, which Zineb participated in. And we looked at narratives of empowerment and disempowerment, and Daesh was particularly effective in trying to push an empowering narrative for women. So, and in fact, went further than any violent extremist groups had done or major violent extremist group had done in the past, by allowing women and encouraging women to travel on their own, right? So not to be attached to a man, but to be allowed to, you can come on your own. You can come and you will have certain roles, which were roles of empowerment. So still within certain traditional roles, but still, roles of teaching, roles of potential for greater education. And then there was also the role of women in the security sector, in terms of women in the moral police. So there was actually quite a surprising, not necessarily, but when you look at similar groups, they pushed quite hard on the women empowerment narrative. And they were also very careful to push this in certain publications and not in others. So in publications that were directed particularly towards women in European countries, this was particularly strong, right? The women as empowerment narrative. Now, if we contrast this to the narratives that were presented by states, and this is true to a certain degree in states across various regions, there was very much of a disempowering narrative. So these women were being seduced, these women were being forced, these women were not choosing to go to Iraq and to Syria. They had no agency in this matter. And I think this empowerment-disempowerment contrast is something that we need to think about in the future, because the assumptions of women as victims potentially creates an attraction towards a group that will present a future for a woman as one of empowerment rather than one of disempowerment. So I think this is one of the things that I would suggest is quite important to look at in the future, when we see narratives develop around women's roles in future groups and in future sort of processes and practices that we will see. The second point I think that's important is the notion of the impact that these narratives have on state policies. So we looked at this question with regards to, particularly we looked at this question with regards to Morocco and Tunisia, with quite contrasting narratives, dominant narratives in the two countries. So a much closer victim narrative in Morocco, and a much closer threat narrative that developed. And of course, these are varied. There wasn't just one narrative, of course, but to a certain degree, there seemed to be a dominant narrative in these two countries that was quite contrasting, and the implications, the policy implications, were interesting in terms of criminalization or not of women, whether the acceptance of women's return from a post caliphate reality, and I think it's very important to understand the degree to which such narratives can influence policy decisions, because these narratives will become dominant in political circles, they will become dominant in media circles, and the sort of the range of policies that become acceptable to policymakers is reduced if by specific narratives, or is at least impacted by these narratives. And I think that what's interesting for me is that I found this this implication, this connection between narratives and policy in very different contexts. So most recently, I've been looking at the context of the UK, and I've been analysing sort of state narratives of a series of video campaigns that the British government published in terms of counterterrorism and in terms of countering violent extremism. And I found it fascinating to note that in a country where the question of women traveling to Syria and Iraq was so prevalent, that in none of these videos there were any women at risk of radicalization. There were no women perpetrators, there were no women suspects, and there were no women at risk of radicalization. So, and all the women were again presented in these supporting roles of women who could help men avoid radicalization, or women who could notice men being radicalized. But they actually had no role within the organization aside from support, right? And I found it really interesting that in a country that where even the media was so focalized on these women traveling, it did not translate into state policy in terms of the state narrative. So the strength of these state narratives is interesting, and how they develop. So I have 2 minutes left, and I'd like to sort of think about sort of lessons learned and policy implications. And I guess the first one is quite obvious, which is just recognize that narratives have gender constructions. Look at them, study them, examine what we're actually saying in terms of, and it's more than just looking at the number of women present. You know, it's what kind of agency are women are given in these narratives? What kind of roles are they given? Do they exist as independent social and political actors, or are they systematically linked to men and existing only in their relationship to men? So that's the first thing I would say. And then, you know, particularly when it comes to state campaigns, state can make their own decisions about what kind of gender constructions they want to push. But I think it has to be a conscious decision. It should not be just well, whatever happens, happens. One has to sit down and look at these gender constructions and make a conscious decision of what kind of gender construction they want to use. The second point is learn from, particularly when it comes to de-radicalization, it's learn from DDR, right? So many mistakes were made in disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration policies in the 1990s when it comes to gender. And there is so much to learn from those policies, whether it is, you know, the DDR campaigns in Sierra Leone, whether you can go further back to the DDR campaigns in Ethiopia and Eritrea. There's so much to learn from the good things and the bad things, and things that worked and things that didn't work in those campaigns. And I think we really should go back and revisit these campaigns in terms of their narratives and in terms of their policies and the connections between the two. And I think that was my 9 minutes and 30 seconds, and I'll give you back the floor, Zainab. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harmony. Indeed, I wanted to mention, you know, your work, you know, looking both at Morocco and Tunisia, victim or security threat, and gendered narratives on women returnees to the MENA region. I think there are great policy recommendations in that paper, and I learned a lot personally from, you know, from collaborating that with you and with other experts. So yes, I hope we will have in the discussion time, some time to discuss both narratives and the implication on policy, looking at two different countries in Morocco and Tunisia. And now we will have our fourth speakers, Dr. Alexis, who is an assistant professor at Troy University. Dr. Alexis is the author of Why Women Rebel, Understanding Women's Participation in Armed Rebel Groups, and co-authored of Insurgent of Women Female Combatants in Civil Wars. She is currently an assistant professor at Troy University. Her research interests include gender issues in international politics, civil wars, conflict management, and Latin America. Today, Dr. Alexis will discuss, data that she collected on women's participation in non-state armed groups, both globally, but with a focus on Africa. She will compare groups on the African continent to others and also highlight some similarities and differences. Uh, the floor is yours, Dr. Alexis. You have 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. And I was really happy to be included on this panel. And I'm also really happy now to be the fourth speaker because I think I get to maybe bring together and contextualize some of what we've heard already. I've been researching women's roles in armed conflict for over a decade now, and I sort of came to wanting to understand more about this issue through what we might call a feminist curiosity. So, I sort of had noticed as I was doing work on civil conflict that there seemed to be a focus in academic and policy literature and media on the radicalization of men, and particularly young men were the focus of a lot of this work. And yet I was also finding stories from places as diverse as Liberia, El Salvador, Colombia, and the Philippines of women participating in these armed groups. And what was interesting to me was that every time I would see these individual accounts coming out of specific cases, it was almost treated as a rediscovery, that in every case it was being remarked upon as if it was something new and unusual. And I thought, how many times do we have to see this before we start to conclude that perhaps this is a more normalized phenomenon than what we might think? So my initial project for my dissertation and for my first book was to kind of collect cross-national data to really give us a better understanding of where women were participating in armed conflict. And so I looked at women's contributions in a couple of different roles. I looked for where women were participating in conflict as combatants. I looked for where women might be leading in some of these armed groups, where women might be supporters, even if they were not considered officially members of these armed groups. And I also looked for how much of that was really taking place based on, forced participation, including conscription and the use of child soldiering. I looked at 72 different armed movements that have been active since the end of the Cold War. And what I found, perhaps unsurprisingly, was that women were present in most of the groups worldwide that I looked at that were active during that time. So about 60% of all armed movements included women in some capacity. About 30% of those were using women as combatants. And just over a quarter of the movements I looked at had women in some kind of leadership role, which I think is counterintuitive to, again, those narratives that we just heard about. Similarly, forced participation is a significant phenomenon in the recruitment of women into armed groups, but I argued that it does not account for the majority of what we see as women participating in these groups. So in other words, in most groups where women were present, forced participation was not being used on any widespread scale, which I argue calls upon us to take a little bit more seriously that agency and what kind of grievances may be bringing women into these groups. similarly, ideology plays a role. I did find women more likely to serve in leftist armed groups, which may have a more, egalitarian view. But again, as I think we've heard about in a couple of the recent cases, there are women being found in groups that I think may seem counterintuitive or surprising. Contextualizing that in terms of the regions that we're discussing today, in the Middle East and North Africa, I found that again, women were active in the majority of armed groups that I looked at, but they were more likely to be in the kind of supporting roles that we've heard about. So things like intelligence gathering, logistics, propaganda, and recruitment, rather than being as combatants or leaders. In sub-Saharan Africa, the participation of women in armed groups was a little bit lower than on average globally, and there was a higher rate of forced participation being used in these organizations. So some of the things that we've heard about today already, forced marriages, kidnapping, things like that. These patterns, I think, really should prompt us to consider particular issues relevant to armed groups within Africa, and we've heard about some of this already. In particular, there's this question of disentangling agency versus coercion as a factor in getting women into these groups. So again, we've seen in some of the examples discussed today how coercive tactics are used to get women to contribute to armed groups. But again, there's also a significant number of women who come to different organizations voluntarily to participate in violence. Incidentally, my findings on this have been confirmed or repeated in work by others in international relations. I believe Jacana Thomas was on one of the panels here yesterday. Kenesha Bond and Reed Wood have also done some research on this. And then there's also another issue, I think, related to visibility with regard to the fact that we tend to know that when we think about peace processes and when we think about DDR programming, the people who are most visible in those processes and most likely to be reached are the people in leadership positions and the people who are combatants. So the individuals with the guns tend to get a lot of attention in these processes. However, women who are in these organizations, because they tend to be concentrated in less visible roles, may not always be reached the way that they should be, or included in discussions about demobilization the way that they should be. And so I don't specifically research post-conflict processes in the African context, but researchers like Diane Mazarana and Megan McKenzie, who have studied DDR processes, have shown how women and girls demobilizing from armed groups are generally treated as victims and not included in post-conflict processes in quite the same way. A number have been left to self-demobilize in places like Liberia and Sierra Leone. Megan McKenzie in Sierra Leone in her research found that women who did participate in job training programs, for example, were often tracked into low-wage jobs that left them less likely to be able to support themselves after conflict. There was also a strong emphasis in some of these post-conflict transitions on reestablishing society as it was before the war, including going back to more traditional gender roles. And I think feminist researchers have argued that such processes have failed women, but they have also failed states. And some of the excellent research by Diane Mazarana, speaking with former female combatants, showed that these women actually had skills that could have been capitalized on, that could have been useful for their communities and societies, including basic medical training, mechanical repair, logistics and procurement, things like that. So, I sort of leave the policy recommendations, and I think we've heard some excellent ones from the other panelists here. But just to point out that I think over the past couple decades, women, peace, and security really has led to many progressive changes and more representation for women in peace processes. But I think it's evident that we still struggle to deal with these questions of how to treat women who have been involved in armed conflict and violent groups. The issue of women who have been ISIS supporters or married to ISIS fighters right now is a really pressing example of that. So I think there is a need to continue to highlight that as an issue. There's also a need to understand that these kind of supporting roles that women are often concentrated in are also important to the conduct of armed conflict. And so we need to think through more, first of all, where we recognize that women are involved in those capacities, but also how to reach women through post-conflict processes and peace negotiations as well. So look forward to any questions and answers or comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alexis, for your presentation. I also have many questions, but I think we have our audience. We have a list of questions. If you allow me, I'll just go to the question session and yeah. So I'll start with question one, and please, you are welcome to our four panelists are welcome, to answer the question. So we have the first question is classifying women binarily as either perpetual of victims, perpetrators, victims, or combatants obscures the nuance of their roles in the extremist conflict. How to change this perception? So if you want to answer, maybe if you want to give us your thoughts and answer, just you can raise the hand and I'll call your name. Or
is that a question or a comment?
No, it is a question.
It's a question. It's a I would say I think we have to class we have to categorize that, of course, like when doing the research as well as the recommendations, etc. I think we have to categorize women if they are victims or actors, etc. So I think that is necessary for it to be as specific as possible.
Okay, thanks, Reda. So Nayanka, Harmony, Alexis.
Yeah, I can come in. I think, I mean, this is absolutely true. There's an incredible variety of roles that women can play. So to give just one example, there's some interesting research that was done by Cryptea, which is a Kenyan Somali research organization, on the roles of women in Al-Shabaab. So intelligence gathering was seen as a particularly strong role that women had within Al-Shabaab. So that, there is a whole variety of roles that, and to a certain degree, one of the problems is that the narratives seem to focus either on victimhood or on these, and here there's interesting work on how violent women are perceived as deviant, as not really women, and there's something just wrong with them, because if not, they wouldn't engage with violence, right? So there's some really good work by Karen Gentry and Laura Schoberg on this. So I think to go beyond this sort of very, very dichotomous position of either evil woman and therefore deviant woman, or somehow the ideal woman that's the victim in this circumstance and needs to be saved, is recognizing that women exist as independent actors, and their level of agency changes, but they're still discrete and distinct human beings that are not necessary, that do not need to be understood as in relation to. And I think that already is a great start in terms of understanding the plurality of roles they can play.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think also, it goes back to, I always talk about context. It goes back to that as well, because in each region or particular society or community, you will have, as Dr. Harmony Taurus mentioned, there are individual people like you and I, like everybody else, and they will have particular grievances that will depend on the context in which they live, especially if you are in a situation of conflict where you have a lot of different factors that come into play, whether or not and those affect the reasons as to why you may join or not, or even why you would be coerced into joining a violent extremist group.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think so much of this, really is being illustrated right now in debates that we're seeing over, what to do with women who have gone to join the Islamic State, for example. That, there seems to be this push one way or the other to see them as victims or to see them as perpetrators, and that really has led to, I think, a lot of the impasse that we've seen around this issue. So I think the need to kind of recognize the complexity of what actually happens in a lot of these armed groups is important to being able to get people the services that they need, but also hold people responsible when necessary for acts that have happened during the conflict. So, in the real world, it's not as simple as assigning someone a role as a victim or a perpetrator. And I think that as long as we fail to recognize that, that these issues are going to keep cropping up again.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I would add that even, VE groups such as Daesh has used, traditional roles of women, plus, women as in the traditional roles as mothers and wives, versus as an individual, independent individuals, to change their roles from just joining their husbands to, being having operational role and committing attacks on the ground. So I have a little technical problem. This is why we miss our face-to-face conferences. So I'll move to question 2. I mean, this is, I think, a comment, but I see this as more a comment, but would love to have also your thoughts. So traditional counterterrorism and countering violent extremism tactics are too often gender blind. Too often they fail to build on the framework of the WPS agenda. Is it due to the policy harmonization issues at the domestic level? So, who wants to comment on that?
I can try. I think it probably is a combination of different factors, but in particular, I would think that we often also talk about these issues today without looking into the role of the state as well. As in particular in West Africa, I would say there is a vacuum of leadership in a lot of these cases, which allows for kind of the emergence of these non-state actors to kind of influence the most vulnerable in society. So I think that in terms of I think Dr. Taurus again mentioned earlier how the state narrative is also important. So the state may have particular ways of framing the conflict, of framing the role of women in a particular context. And that obviously then reverberates and influences the kinds of policies we see in place. I think it would be great to kind of go back to grassroots levels and to also look at those groups that are emerging within society itself. And as I mentioned, the role of, for example, in Nigeria, the NIM Foundation, that has seen a gap in what is happening in those communities of people that have returned, that had participated in Boko Haram violence and that have returned, and the huge amount of mental health support that they are providing. So there are initiatives like that that look at the ways of the gendered roles of women in those particular contexts, but they do lack support from the wider state. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, Dr. Alexis, Dr. Harmony, any thoughts? So I can move to question 3.
No, I mean just to say that I think in some of the research that's been done on this, we have seen that there is a certain degree of essentialism that might get baked into either women, peace, and security, or to national action plans related to that as well. The association of women as peace builders or forces for peace tends to lead to these outcomes that maybe fail to recognize the potential for women to be radicalized, right? Or the potential for women to, actively act against these programs as well.
Great, thank you. So now I'll go to question three. So women in extremist contexts vary widely in terms of their age, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, disability, migration status, and so forth. Painting with a broad brush in counterproductive. How to get information that can help make targeted, gender sensitive, and intersectional decisions when designing programs and policies, while data is not always easily available and or accessible.
So I'll start with this, and I find this really, really interesting because, and I find this difficult in my own work. So, on one side, there's a recognition that not that first of all that gender is not only a woman's issue, which we need to get there, but also that gender is not binary, right? But when it comes to violent extremism, all of that goes out the window to a certain degree, right? And we return to these incredibly binary constructions of man and woman, male and female, and absolutely traditional understandings of family, and it really is difficult. I think for some reason, the moment violence comes into it, or we feel the need to resort back to these very, very traditional, but also not reflective of realities on the ground. And I think absolutely, in terms of research and policy, we have to make an extra effort to recognize that, and to go beyond these really strong binary constructions that seem to be very strongly grounded in CVE, PVE, and counterterrorism. Counterterrorism probably even more than CVE and PVE, and it links to what the previous question as well. Is that in work on women, peace, and security, there has been great steps forward in understanding the multiplicity of roles that women can have, but the multiplicity of gender and gender constructions, and the fact and breaking down these binary constructions. But this hasn't quite moved into the sort of counterterrorism, CVE, PVE world yet. And I think there's a real need to ensure that sort of the progress made in women, peace, and security moves into CT and PVE and CVE, rather than having sort of very binary strict constructions from the CT world moving into the women and peace and security agenda, right? So I think it's quite important, because there is that danger sometimes, but it is something that we need to be sort of very conscious of and constantly aware of in our research, and I find that quite hard, actually.
Yes.
If I might just add to what Dr. Harmony just mentioned about the sensitivity, and then when we work in the conflict areas, things that we have to be aware of like our actions as a program. When we implement programs, I think we have to take in consideration that what our action could cause. For example, when we come in and we don't have that data, like as you mentioned, and in the question, I think we have to collect that data about ethnicity, age, etc. All that data, we have to collect it, and we have to be aware of the impacts of our action. Like, for example, if we implement programs that only touch and work with women, or including aid, if we distribute aid to just women, we have to also take in consideration what would be the reaction of their male counterparts, brothers, husbands, fathers, and then what would that do to the social cohesion and to the tensions within the community, within the family, between the husband and the wife, and father and daughters, as well as between communities from different ethnic background. I think all of that, all of those things had as program managers or implementers, I think we have to take all these factors in and when we do this conflict sensitivity analysis prior to the implementation of programs.
Thank you, Rida. Nayanka, Alexis, do you have any thoughts? Otherwise, I also have a question. I will take the opportunity of having four terrific experts to ask a question, which I just faced, in the field as I'm in a work trip in the field about female returnees. But please, if you have any thoughts, comments about the last third question, Alexis, Nayanka.
Well, I think just to say that I think it's interesting the way that the question was phrased because, I mean, yes, the roles of women in these groups are complex and the identities of women in these groups are complex. So are the identities of men in different ways. And so this notion of, having to have, intersectional interventions, I think is important, not just in the gender context, but in the overall context as well.
Thank you. Okay. Nayanka, do you want to add something?
No, because I think I will be repeating myself. I think that, and I have kind of a quite a critical approach when thinking of implementing any kinds of programs in contexts that we're not necessarily familiar with. So again, it would be about thinking about dialogue. It would be thinking about what kinds of conversations are already happening within these communities, and then taking it from there, seeing what is already there. A lot of the time, we assume that we have all the knowledge, but a lot, like I mentioned in particular, for example, in northern eastern Nigeria, there is a long history of kind of progressive movements fighting against all sorts of violence, either from the insurgent group or from their own government that has been absent at different points in history. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the terrific speakers. I have a question to you. I've been, and Harmony mentioned, we did collaborate in work about the role of women, but also, I did research the role of women in VE groups, and I do between theory and practice. I'm a practitioner. So when we look at the role of women, of course, throughout history, and um, Alexis, mentioned, the role of women in different armed groups, and not only looking at Daesh, Boko Haram, etc. Of course, they have been active, etc. And then looking at, also why these women join. Of course, we found, different. Some women joined to follow their husbands, other just joined voluntarily. So but here, yes, so then we have both narratives, in Harmony's paper about victims and security threats, but also the work I was researching looking at women. Yes, we found both. There are the victims, but also there are the activists and the preparators, and who might be still a security threat. So now coming at the practical level, I was in a fieldwork trip trying to work on, we have now a challenging problem, female returnees to the region coming back from Syria and Iraq. And I was talking about these two narratives. There was, civil society, government institutions. We were discussing female returnees and, gender sensitive rehabilitation, reintegration programs in Morocco, how, of course, looking at different experiences and how to put, a comprehensive. Morocco is engaged in a global, in a whole of society approach in terms of rehabilitation, reintegration, which does not only include government agencies, but also CSOs and local communities, in order to not only rehabilitate the individual, but also help reintegrate in society. And then when I was, talking about that women are actors, and they can still be a security threat. They can still be ideologically, they can influence ideologically their kids, etc., their children. And then one participant told me, yes, if I consider this woman, she is back with her children from Syria and Iraq, and if I consider her a security threat, and then of course we have policymakers whether prosecute, reintegrate, and rehabilitate. Okay, then she's a security threat. She has to be prosecuted and go to jail. But then what about the children? She has three sons or three children with her. Will be separated from him, their mom. Where we will put children? And I was, it is, yeah. So at the practical level, so what do you think? So about, yeah, just yesterday I received this question in that meeting, and I was like, yeah. So, any thoughts? So,
I can
did
jump
you?
briefly. I think the last thing you want to do is to make these children feel being victims. For example, like you don't want to make them feel first. You need to have programs in place. I think the state, civil society organizations, NGOs, they need to have programs in place so that they could prevent making those children feel the being victimized of what happened, and then accuse either the state or NGOs of putting them in a dire situation later on. So I think that's one feeling that, in addition to other things that need to be in place for them to, so they can avoid for them to fall in that trap of having that feeling of grievances and resentment toward the state. I think that's my humble opinion about this situation.
Thank you, Rida. I don't want to pinpoint on Harmony,
No,
but she.
but I mean, I think it's interesting. First of all, I think it's interesting that this is a question that's asked with mothers, but not with fathers, right? So the fact that their fathers are in jail sort of doesn't apparently not so much of a problem. But that's fine. I mean, it's not. I find it interesting, but most of all, I think we have to be careful in terms of the radicalization. Not creating. To use it, not creating the next cause célèbre, to use the French term, right? Because you don't want the situation of having a whole series of children that become the next focal point for violent extremist groups to say, look at your state, look at what your state is doing. Like they are separating families, they are forcing children to be raised as orphans, or forcing children to be raised in jail. So there is also, again, a narrative element to this, which is that has to be taken into account. You don't want to be recreating a situation where in 5 years' time there's a new cause to rally around because the state has separated families, or created a new generation of children who haven't who have a sense of grievance, effectively against the state. So I think it's absolutely a very difficult proposition. At the same time, I think we need to recognize that not only when Daesh was in control of the territory, so within the so-called caliphate, did women take part in acts of violence, or in supporting acts of violence, or in supporting radicalization. But in a post-caliphate reality, within within the camps, you have another reality that takes place where radicalization could occur, and that is something that we can't ignore. We shouldn't be ignoring it, but there is a political decision to be made from state actors to decide what is the least dangerous path for them to tread, and it's absolutely not an easy one to take.
If,
Thank
if
you.
I add very quickly,
Yes,
Zainab,
yes,
since we're
please.
not talking, and since you mentioned this does not concern only violence extremist organizations, that we talk also about armed groups. And like if we look at Mali that I've looked at the past decade, you still talk to young men or women, they're still talking about the 60s, the massacres of the 60s carried by the state and to legitimize their rebellions, etc. And then also at the same time, some people are talking in central Mali and other parts of Niger and Burkina Faso right now as well, accusing the state of acts of atrocities, and they are not going to forget that. Like they're not going to the kids, the new generation, are not going to forget those atrocities, and so it's a generational thing, and it's still relevant to this day. So um,
I
that's
think,
just one
thank
another
you.
example.
Thank you. I think you still have 1 minute, but here again, I was just to want to share, I was faced with this question, but then I said we need to look at two women as individuals, who, etc. Plus, because we see women and children, mothers, but also there is reality. But what about also if the woman was still ideologically engaged with the VE groups and does not go through, a de-radicalization reintegration program, and then she can ideologically, and also she can influence her children and to join VE groups in the future anyway. But here, just to mention that, there is not one answer, and I think all the speakers, when in all your presentations, you all discussed that, there are different narratives, there are different roles, there are different, factors, drivers that push these women to join, and that any policy, need to look at, all these different narratives and consider that. So yes, we have, I think we have, yeah, 1 minute. Maybe if you want, Dr. Alexis, what about, from your extensive research and experience in, armed groups, what do you think, would you have, thoughts about, this question about will we separate mothers from children, etc.?
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting, question to ask because it really, speaks to, I think, a philosophy of transitional justice, and how, what means you believe are the best to go about pursuing that. And this is it's interesting to hear that those discussions are taking place in the context that you're working in because, the other conflict that I've been looking at post-conflict transition a lot is Colombia and speaking to people who have been involved in that DDR process. Here's another situation where you have an extremely prolonged armed conflict. You have thousands of people who have been involved in that, and certainly it's not going to be feasible to prosecute everyone who has been involved in that. So what other means do we think about to maybe break down some of those ties to armed groups, to hold people responsible, doing things like truth commissions or setting up special jurisdictions to deal with some of these cases. I mean, there's a universe of approaches out there. And I think one of the themes that we've heard from, all of the panelists today is that, having context and local knowledge input is crucially important to developing those processes.
Thank you very much. Especially, your work on different armed groups and in Latin America is important. We need to learn from all, and I think mentioned all the speakers mentioned that we need to look at Harmony, Nayanka, Reda, the other DDR programs in other countries to learn from what worked, what did not work, and try today to have a new generation of DDR programs, of course we being gender sensitive, and because yeah, and I think they added us 5 minutes, or I think we have 5 minutes. So Nayanka, please, do you have thoughts about your work and your reflections and your research about northern Nigeria? I had I spent some time in Maiduguri, but it was on DDR, but of course PCVE and Boko Haram. So your work is very interesting. So, and here again in the question about women and children, yeah, so your thoughts.
I think I echo all the other speakers in saying it's quite a difficult question to answer. It goes into more kind of what is the political message we want to send out. And I can think of, for example, the famous or infamous case in the UK of Shamina Begum, for example, and all the questions around her nationality, whether she can return to the UK or not, and her children who are with her in the Syrian camp. So I think they're quite complex issues, but I think that the strongest point is that it is a very politically charged decision. So you'd have to, again, look at the different issues at stake. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I also go to the papers, victims or security threats with the Harmony, where even the dominant, when she was, looking at narratives in Tunisia, she looked at the dominant narrative was as a threat, but then there was another challenging narrative that women and children, and the children are victims, and yeah, so exactly these are complex issues that that need, of course, a multidisciplinary approach plus a comprehensive approach and also that should involve all actors in society, not only the security agencies, government institutions, and civil society and communities. It brings to also, and I have to wrap up, they told me I need to wrap up, also, in just yesterday as well, discussing with the different actors, like it was mentioned, the stigma, in their communities and the stigma in schools. They call them the sons and the daughters of Daesh, of ISIS. So also working at the community level, it's very key, very important, including the schools, because any reintegration rehabilitation program without working on stigma at the community, I think it will not be as successful. Anyway, I have to wrap up. Thank you very much. I learned a lot today. So thank you very much, of course, colleagues and friends. And it has been an honor to moderate this panel. I hope we will have a face-to-face meeting, inshallah, by the grace of God, anytime soon. Thank you, the Policy Center for the New South, for engaging us in this important contemporary debate and security challenge. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.